Hello, everybody. This is season 2, episode 12 of Aids to Scouting. And tonight we have a college professor who's going to talk to us about all kinds of things, whatever comes up and gets into our minds tonight. Is Dr. Douglas Young, the University of Georgia system. He taught mostly, I believe, Doug, correct me if I'm wrong, but up at Gainesville at the extension there. But you went to the University of Georgia, right?
That's correct. I got all my degrees from the University of Georgia in Athens, and my first 12 years of being a professor, I taught political science and history at Gordon College in Barnesville, Georgia, and then from mid-1999 through the end of 2020, I taught mostly political science and also some history at what was initially Gainesville College, and then it became Gainesville State College, and then in 2013 it became the Gainesville campus of the new University of North Georgia.
Well, you know, one thing people might say, well, what are we having a college professor on here on aids to scouting? And so what I just as a little preliminary remark, and you and I have spoken about it on the phone, is that scouts are, as you know, are aware, and as people all over the world know, have a strong civic presence, and they have and that learning civics is an important part of being a scout. You know, we'll talk about that in all kinds of ways, but why don't you talk about your experience of helping people to study and learn and get excited about the study of history? Take it away, Doug.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me on as y'all's guest. I'm really honored and delighted to be here. I love teaching history, and I love giving addresses about various historical figures and topics because I think that there's arguably nothing more fascinating, and if taught right, there's no other course that's as exciting, as full of suspense and drama and victory and defeat, triumph and tragedy as history. History is the story of man. And as the great Roman philosopher Cicero wrote, he who only knows his own generation remains always a child. And as the great 20th century Spanish American poet and philosopher George Santa Anna put it, those who forget the mistakes of the past are condemned to repeat them. And I think that we can and should learn so much from history because, as someone put it, history teaches us how to behave, or it should. And I believe that history does repeat itself. The great historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote about how he wrote a book entitled The Cycles of History. And he dealt with how there are trends in history that repeat themselves. And even in my 64 years, I have seen trends come and go in my own lifetime in America. I love what I think it was Mark Twain who wrote that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I think that as a historian and as a political scientist, one of my biggest frustrations with so many of our elected public officials, especially a lot of presidents, is how woefully ignorant of history I think they are, even of American history and even of recent American history. And so I think that it's critically important for any people who want to move their society forward in a positive direction, who want to preserve what's good about their history and their traditions and their culture, and who want to improve their nation and the world. I think it's really important that they study not just their own national history, but global history, and look at events and chapters, sagas from the past, and see present day parallels and learn from the successes and failures of our ancestors.
If I can interrupt for a moment,
Sure.
as you're talking, I'm a well-read man.
Sure.
I mean, quite honestly, of course I am. I'm old for one thing, and so I've had a lot of time to read, and I've read a lot of the kind of people you're talking about. Now, maybe a lot of our listeners, especially the younger ones, are not even familiar with a lot of the names. For example, Mark Twain, was considered a great intellectual in his day in Europe, particularly. Here, he was considered a humorist, but
even though he never went to college.
Yes, well, yeah, that's right. Well, folks out there, Mark Twain's the guy that wrote Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, and
that's right,
Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, and so I'm just thinking, Doug, I don't know if we'll be able to post. It'd be great to have this little list of names that we're talking about. So anybody that's listening to this, and as our viewership goes, I think we're going to have more people tuning in to past issues. So
wonderful.
So maybe they'll say, well, wait a minute now, that college professor said something about Cicero. Who in the world is Cicero? It sounds like the yard man we had or something like that. And so anyway, and that's one thing I like about Wikipedia is how, especially for ancient history, you can find these things and you can find out when a person lived and what they were famous for and so forth. Now, I've interrupted you, and so if you were talking to a 14-year-old and who you think kind of needs a wake-up call, I think you've just already given the clarion call for that. And so keep on going.
Sure. Speaking of Mark Twain, one of my favorite quotes of his is, "I never let schooling interfere with my education." And there's another old saying, and I think it's true, that the B students will end up working for the C students and the A students will teach. Most of our education should take place outside the classroom. And obviously, I'm certainly in favor of people learning as much as they can at school and studying as much as they need to get whatever kind of grades they need for whatever kind of degree and career they want. But I think a truly educated person, a real intellectual, is someone who reads a great deal independently on his own, who passionately pursues his own intellectual interest, reading as far and wide as he can. And he should expose himself to as many different ideas as possible. I absolutely believe that ideas are truly the great engines of history, because as the great French playwright and novelist Victor Hugo put it, no army can withstand the strength of an idea whose time has come. And we can look at so many major reform movements in history that completely defied centuries of odds against them. And they prevailed not through force of arms, but through the power of their ideas. I mean, look at the strength of the labor union movement in this country in the latter 19th century. It was only once a few very determined people, appalled by abuses in a number of factories, it was only when these folks went to the news media to voice their complaints, when they tried to persuade workers to organize themselves into a union, to even consider going on strike, to fight for higher wages, did this initially very small movement started to mushroom. And I'm reminded of who was it? I believe it was Henry David Thoreau wrote that all truth goes through. No, it was Gandhi. I'm sorry. It was Mohandas Gandhi, the great Indian Hindu religious and political and civil rights leader. Gandhi wrote that all truth passes through three phases. First, it is ridiculed, then it is violently opposed, and then it's accepted as self-evident. And initially, the labor union movement was laughed at. It was a joke. But then when it started gaining steam, whoa, factory owners hired the Pinkerton Guards and started cracking workers' heads. But who today would say that people in a free society should not have the right to join a labor union?
Well, we could get into an argument about that, because the other side of it is and this is we're trying to be non-political on all of our things. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. But
and there are always at least two sides to every issue.
Well, when you're talking about an idea that has come, the idea of self-government is one that I think addresses a lot of what scouts need to learn and think about when they're working on their citizenship in the nation merit badge, or for that matter, citizenship in the community. The actual involvement of people, that government is of the people and by the people, and at least hopefully for the people, and so that's so. And then when you talk about an idea that time has come, I was thinking 1776 and 75, and a lot of kids don't know the name Thomas Paine, but maybe you could tell them what Thomas Paine was. I think he was born in England, right?
That's right. Thomas Paine was an Englishman who frankly failed at everything he ever tried in England. He was a failure until he was about 40, failed bad marriage, drunk, failed at every job he had. And in middle age, he just said, the heck with it. I'm going to leave Britain and I'm going to go to America and just, try out, just begin a whole new life. And in this country, he found out after failing at everything else, he tried journalism and he realized he was very good at it. And he was a pretty obnoxious character. He didn't have a lot of friends. He was sort of emotionally incontinent. He was incapable of being moderate about anything. He was a fanatic. He saw everything in terms of all or nothing, good or evil. And he had real bitterness towards everything British, because that was where all of his failures had been. And so he becomes journalistically something of a success here. And he becomes convinced that the British are really terribly oppressing the Americans. They're taxing us without any representation in Parliament. They are restricting our religious freedoms by forcing us, if we want to have a legally recognized marriage, for our children to not be regarded as illegitimate. You have to be married by a Church of England, an Anglican priest, on and on and on. And they were restricting our rights to freely express opposition to the crown. And so when the American Revolution came, he was totally gung-ho for it. And when we of course lost most of the battles and things were going very badly for us, when in January of 1776, with his own money, he self-published Common Sense, which was about a 44-page revolutionary propaganda pamphlet, the greatest propaganda of the American Revolution. And this pamphlet, in layman's terms that the everyday Americans could easily understand, it eloquently made the case, and very passionately, for American independence. He wrote about how it was absurd for a small country like Britain, the United Kingdom, or the island of Great Britain, which is no bigger than the state of Georgia, sort of a satellite, if you will, to be controlling this vast Atlantic seaboard across the Atlantic Ocean. And he was so dedicated to the cause that he didn't make any money off of it, even though Common Sense was sold incredibly well. In fact, during the American Revolution, the only book that was in more American homes than Common Sense was the Holy Bible. But Thomas Paine took every cent that he earned from the sales of Common Sense and gave it to pay for shoes and mittens for the soldiers, the barefoot soldiers in the Continental Army. And later, when the war, and boy, let me say this, Common Sense was a huge adrenaline rush for the revolutionary movement. Remember, only about 1/3 of the American people supported the revolution. An equal third of Americans were active traders supporting the British. And
Well, wait a minute. I don't know if you'd call them a traitor if they were supporting the king.
And they call themselves loyalists.
That's right. That's right.
To the American cause.
Yeah.
But they would say that they were faithful.
That's right.
And obedient to the law. And before the American Revolution, most all Americans thought of themselves as Englishmen. That we were citizens of the British Empire, and very proudly so. I mean, it was the greatest empire of all time.
Doug, to interrupt for a minute, I've been thinking that one of the issues that if I could dictate the educational system is I kind of believe in the memorization of dates, if that's possible. Like say 30 different dates. When was the Dark Ages, essentially? When did Columbus arrive? And I think a lot of kids these days, tell me about your experience as a professor about having these young people come in. Yeah, I remember one time you were saying what good students you had up at Gainesville, and that you were kind of like almost surprised at how good they were and how studious they were.
What I found throughout my little over 1/3 of a century teaching political science and history was that most of the students were very interested to learn about history, including political history. But they were quite ignorant of it because it had never really been taught. When so many of them in high school had as an excuse for a history teacher, a jock PE coach with a free period.
Yeah.
And they might watch, Friday night football games during class. My 10th grade world history experience, there was never a single lecture all 9 months. The teacher, very nice man, but he was the basketball coach at the high school, and he picked out the 5 of us who he thought were the best readers, and each day in class, we would each read about 5 or 10 pages, and that was it. That was 10th grade world history. And I mean, we would never dream of having people teach English or math without earning degrees in those fields. But the social sciences are the academic ghetto of American middle and high schools. And so we have a lot of unqualified teachers, and an enormous share of high school history teachers never majored in history. And so what I found was that my students were simply ignorant about history, not stupid about it, but ignorant. They had never been taught much history. And what little history that they did know, it had been, they had learned it in such a shallow, superficial way. To be fair to the history teachers were under the gun to cover an enormous amount of history in a limited period of time. And so they, I think, too often teach the test. And the test is nothing but a multiple choice test. There are no term papers, typically no essay tests. So the students are not taught the one thing they should be taught the most, which is how to engage in critical thinking. Yes. You just memorize a bunch of stuff. Now, I'm in favor of students having to learn the sequence of events. They should know event A or development A led to event or development B. I would like students to know July 4th, 1776. I would like them to know, July 1st through 3rd, 1863, the battle, the dates for the Battle of Gettysburg. But to me, that's sort of getting into Trivial Pursuit. That's Jeopardy time. And you can memorize all kinds of dates and still
Well,
be absolutely clueless as to their significance.
well, Elliot, what is it you want to?
Well, to a
And
few things. So, just to add, we are live, and we've gotten a comment from one of our listeners. Her name's Emily, and she says that it has unfortunately been redacted for our school kids. They are not taught what dates that we should know because history does serve as an example. So we're seeing that, and I want to speak from my own uh, my own personal experience. I'm 28 and I graduated 10 years ago. So, and in my high school, you're certainly absolutely right. We're taught how to take a test and take it well and pass the test. So I'm
Right.
fantastic at listening to a couple of lectures and I don't even need to take notes because I know exactly how they're going to ask the questions on the test. And
We,
once I complete that test, that information is just as good as gone. And I've been trained that way for my entire schooling career. And also, I want to add to the history. I didn't know until just now that the proceeds from Thomas Paine's Common Sense went into helping to fund the war. I didn't have any. I knew that it was a popular thing. I knew that it led to most of the ideas in Common Sense led to the official documents written up just a little bit later. So I knew that much, but I didn't realize that the proceeds went to that, and that's pretty cool to know that because he did that. That also helped with being a community leader and more than just his ideas, but in the practice of what happened afterwards. So that actually leads me to something that I want to ask you because I read a lot of your CV and looked through it, and I looked up a few things about you, and it looks to me like you've got over nearly 400 hours of logged reading time to blind and dyslexic people. Is that true?
yes, when I lived in Athens, when I was a graduate student, I was so consumed with writing my doctoral dissertation. It was so demanding and it took up so much time. I felt guilty at how all of my work was just for me. I felt so selfish that I was not contributing to anybody else's benefit. And I needed a break from the dissertation. And so it was just a wonderful way to get outside of my own little narrow dissertation world and to tangibly, physically help people read who couldn't read because of dyslexia or blindness. And I learned a great deal. I got to read so many fascinating books. I got to read Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind and John Irving's, one of his novels. I can't remember the name of it. But in any event, I learned a great deal and I met the most wonderful people, largely retired, but a lot of younger people too. And so I think it's really something that we should all strive to do if we can, to try to volunteer as much as we can to help others. And I think we will find that we help ourselves tremendously in doing so.
Yeah, I
You
think
know,
that
you
the
go
add on,
ahead.
almost, you're almost there, Walker. Uh, so giving back when you have the time and the capabilities to people that may not have those capabilities or the time to do that, absolutely it leads to great community leadership, I would say, and not to relate it necessarily to funding a war, but it is the same. It is the same idea of using what you've got and the time that you have and giving back. Another thing that James Coker, who happens to be my dad, my namesake there, he comments, free expression shouldn't include ignorance by voice or actions. Critical thinking is not common any longer. He says to watch Washington Spies. So there's our more of our live feed there.
I think that far more important than teaching history to students or teaching any subject to students is to help them learn how to think critically. Because let's face it, even the best students are probably going to forget about 90% of the facts of the information that they learn in any class. But if a teacher can help a student figure out how to think more rationally, logically, intelligently, creatively, and always independently, wow, those critical thinking skills, that rational, logical kind of thinking, those skills can be applied to every endeavor that student ever engages in for the rest of his life. And so I think it's so important that we teach critical thinking. And I required all of my tests for freshman and sophomore classes in college were half essay and half non-essay. And then all of my junior and senior level class tests were all essay. And the sophomore, junior, and senior level students all had to write a term paper. It's so important that we learn how to organize our thoughts, how to research information, how to study topics well. We need to force ourselves to expose ourselves to a wide variety of perspectives, not just those that agree with us. It's okay, it's great if we're all singing from the same hymnal in church, but in the political sphere, in the historical sphere, in the public sphere, I think if we're going to have real freedom, a true free marketplace of ideas, as my father would say, it's absolutely essential that we read as much as possible, that we learn as much as possible about as many different ways of interpreting whatever issues we're examining.
I don't know if you know this, but sometimes I do a Baden-Powell act. And so Baden-Powell will sit there and say, look, kids, when he's talking to young kids, he'll say, this is very serious business disguised as a game. And for example, your marksmanship, you may have to defend yourself or your family or your country someday. And so that's why citizenship in the nation becomes so important, because so that you can have critical thinking about people who are going to put you out there on the front line shooting at folks. You are getting shot at. I mean, you got to have that. We have to have that kind of critical thinking. And the fact that people are going to get hurt and killed in a war doesn't mean that your side's wrong, and it doesn't mean that your side's right. I sometimes think of German kids out there flying over Britain, trying to, in the Battle of Britain. And then all these kids these days, a lot of them don't know what the Battle of Britain is. They have no idea. Or I know people that don't have any idea. I've met plenty of people who had no idea who was on which side during World War I and World War II. Or for that matter, they don't know much about the American Civil War.
Right, or even the Cold War.
Yeah.
I think that the ruling class of this society does not want a very intelligent, critical thinking citizenry. Indeed, the people who created the modern American public school system in the early 20th century, people like the socialist philosopher John Dewey, Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, they only wanted to educate the American people just enough so that they would be compliant, loyal, obedient factory workers and who would obey government policies. And if you look at the schools that we still have today, they look like factories, do they not?
Oh, I think a lot of them look like prisons.
Sure, exactly.
One time I went to see a guy in prison down in, I think it was Coweta County, and I thought I had come across the prison, but it wasn't. It was the school.
Right.
And a lot of them even have little guard towers. They're fake bell towers, but they look like guard towers.
I remember I was teaching a night class for Gordon College at a Griffin, Georgia high school. It was a great big high school because, so many high schools are so big now, even though I think the studies show that students learn much better in smaller schools. But you got to have a real big school to have a big football team. And that's the real priority in so many schools. And
excuse me for interrupting, but
Can I finish my thought, please?
Yeah, of course, please.
Thank you. As I was saying, at this Griffin High School, I'll never forget, you had these different wings of the school. There was one long middle wing, and then there would be wings coming out on the side, and then you'd have this, yard space between each wing. And I noticed walking down the main hallway, the only hallway that connected to all these other side wings, I noticed that at every intersection, there was some kind of, it looked like a sliding door.
Yes.
And I remember I asked this high school gal who was, giving me a tour of the place. I said, what are these sliding doors for? And she got so excited, and she said, oh, that's so in case there's a riot, we can seal it off. Now, that's also what we learned when I used to take my students at Gordon to the death row prison in Jackson, Georgia, the Georgia Diagnostic and Testing Center.
Yep. It's one aspect of this consolidation of schools I think of is how the Soviet Union thought that they could help agriculture by collectivizing the farms. And so it's, now you have, rather than kids can walk to school in their local small town, they're bused 15 or 20 miles to this collective farm where they, and it's kind of sad. And I don't know what the moral is here for those of our listeners who find themselves in such schools or supporting such schools. But, I'm kind of thinking that, like you said a while ago, education, especially history, is something that you learn. The teacher maybe inspires you. The Doug Young gets out there and inspires you, but it's that reading and I think watching really good movies is a great thing. Like the two movies that stick in my mind when I was a child was Dr. Zhivago, about life during the Russian Revolution of a common doctor who gets caught up in everything and the waste of war. And then, of course, Gallipoli. That's an interesting movie about how a young man thinks he's going to go off and have a great adventure. And the old man says, you just don't understand.
Right.
You will have no control over what happens to you. And so those kind of things, those kind of movies that are realistic and have, I think even Gone with the Wind is a good movie. I think the book is better.
I agree.
But it's interesting. And I won't, I've written some history books, fiction. I just have that big one coming out now, Radium Springs, that people can listen to audio.
Cheers.
And so it has a lot of history in it because it kind of relates back to when the Spanish first came to Georgia in 1540. And a lot of people go, what? What happened? And, they don't know. I can remember, and I'm going to let you talk some more, but I can remember when I was in about the third grade in a public school, they marched us into a room and we watched a television presentation of geography. And it was very well done. And I think geography is an extremely important subject for kids to learn because otherwise they have no concept of, what country can't possibly attack another because they're not next to them and stuff like that. So go ahead, Doug.
I agree. To me, every nation's government is the inevitable byproduct of its history, culture, religion, and geography. And I think that island nations all share certain characteristics. Large countries with lots of natural resources share certain common characteristics. And absolutely, I think that Georgia history is so fascinating. And you're talking about the Spanish in Georgia. I think of the Battle of Bloody Marsh. I think that was in 1742 between the British and General Oglethorpe and the Spanish. And because the English won that battle, we speak English today. So yes, history has enormous consequences.
I,
And I think that we will only move forward as a people if we have learned what has worked in the past and what has failed. And one of my favorite economists is the great Dr. Thomas Sowell, who's in his 90s now. And I mean, he's just the personification of the American dream. I mean, he grew up, I think he was born in North Carolina, but he grew up mostly in Harlem, black in Jim Crow America. And he has written that we have pursued so many terrible public policies simply because our intentions were so good. And he has pointed out that, as my guru, Dennis Prager, says, good intentions count for nothing. As the old adage goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We need to have a historical, fact-based understanding of public policies in terms of what kinds have worked and what kinds have not worked. And if we don't understand history well, then we're forever reinventing the wheel.
one of the history things that I have read probably 3 times is the 6th volume Winston Churchill of World War II. And
that won the Nobel Prize for Literature, I think.
I think so. And it was, it's not only is it just great history, but it's also great style of writing and great style of organization. And gosh, Churchill had such a comprehensive view of history. He was a descendant of Marlborough, who was a famous British general in about 1540 or something like that.
You've got me. Sorry.
1620, I don't know, but at any rate, but Churchill was a marvel, and
a real Renaissance gentleman.
Yes.
He was incredibly accomplished in so many different fields of endeavor: war, peace, journalism, history, you name it.
Yep, it was great. Another thing I think that I go to places and ask kids about Baden-Powell, and it's so easy for scouts to find out about Baden-Powell, and through Wikipedia you can just read a few paragraphs and you're caught up to scale. But a lot of people, it's amazing how many folks just don't know much history.
Wikipedia can be really informative.
Yep.
Presenting us with a lot of hopefully good information really fast.
Yep.
But there have been a number of instances where, because most anybody can add to Wikipedia, some pretty totally false statements were made. And so when I taught, I would not accept Wikipedia as a scholarly source.
Yes.
And I would tell anyone reading Wikipedia, if you read something on there and you weren't aware of it, you've never read or heard that before, Google it or Grok it, DuckDuckGo it, and see if you can find some other sources for it.
Yep. Well, I agree.
And Wikipedia, I would say that about any conservative political publication, as well as any liberal publication or a libertarian one or a socialist one. We've all got biases. There's an old adage that goes, you can tell where a man sits. You can tell where a man stands by where he sits. we all have our own biases.
Well, I've often told people that, in my opinion, the observation of Wikipedia is that the more modern it is, the more skeptical you should be. But if it's like, what year was the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest? And that's when the Roman legions were ambushed by the Germans in I think 8 AD or something like that. And so you can find that nobody is going to want to mess with that because they don't have a political bias about that date. But at any rate, so those are I just use it as kind of a research of dates and times. So I'll have a framework. So.
Right. I'll never forget when I was in China in May of 2008, when there was that terrible earthquake. It was fascinating to be in hotel rooms that the communist government would allow a few Western cable news networks in. They would allow CNN and the BBC. Now, they wouldn't dare allow Fox. Fox was considered too capitalist, too conservative. But it was fascinating to watch how China Central Television, CCTV, which is Chinese Communist Party government propaganda, how it covered the earthquake, and then to see how CNN and the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, covered it. And the coverage on the Chinese network would show, oh, look, our heroic People's Liberation Army soldiers have rescued yet another Chinese from the rubble of this fallen building. And people would be applauding. And then you would see the Chinese leaders, Hu Jintao, the president, or Premier Li Peng, and they would be going into hospitals and they would be visiting the wounded, and the staff are applauding. It was all propaganda. And then, and the casualty figures were much, much, much lower than you would hear watching CNN or the BBC. CNN and the BBC would talk about all the faulty construction that caused so many buildings to collapse. CCTV never mentioned that, but I think the Chinese Communist Party punished and maybe even executed some builders. I don't know if that was publicized, but in any event, CNN and the BBC had much more negative coverage. And to me, this is symptomatic. To be fair to the Chinese, I regard most all American national journalism today as really morally no better, or to be fair, worse than Chinese communist propaganda. It's all propaganda pushing political view of the particular newspaper or radio station or network. I mean, Fox is pushing a conservative bias. CNN and MS Now are pushing a liberal bias. And they're not necessarily lying, but most of the propaganda comes from what different networks and newspapers choose to not cover.
Well, I was thinking maybe it's the kind of people that they hire. And it's sort of like, let's face it, I've seen these studies where it says how many of your college professors at Harvard or someplace like that, how many of them are Democrat Party members? And it's like 95 or 98%.
Right.
So that, of course, raises the issue of, well, why is it so high if, the vote in America is 50-50 or something
Right.
like that? And then the answer is, of course, because they're doing the hiring. And
Right.
so of course, the news media is kind of that way. It's the kind of people they hire.
Right.
And so what does this mean to scouts?
I think that scouts, like everybody, should gather their news, their information, whatever essays and articles they choose to read from as many different sources as possible. Don't just read from the liberal New York Times, read from the more conservative Wall Street Journal. Don't just read from, or don't just listen to National Public Radio. Also listen to a conservative talk show host, Eric Erickson out of Atlanta. Don't just read the Atlantic Monthly, a liberal opinion magazine. Read from National Review as well, a conservative one. So, get your news from as many sources as possible. And the more you do that, the more information you'll have that liberal publications are ignoring, and other information you'll get from liberal publications that conservative publications are ignoring or downplaying. But be skeptical of everybody. I told my students to question everything you hear from me too. And any little opinion of mine plus $1.50 will buy you a Coke. You always think for yourself. And
What?
some things, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. Some things are subjective, a matter of taste.
Well, I always think that too, that I believe the citizenship in the nation, correct me if I'm wrong, Elliot, but it requires a child, a scout, to actually read the U.S. Constitution.
Wonderful.
Which is it not? It doesn't.
So, matter of fact, I've got a resident expert on the citizenship of the nation merit badge in studio. Would you like me to bring him on?
Yeah. Bring him on.
Sounds good. Here's my father. This is James, everyone.
Hi,
Hello,
good evening.
James.
Good evening, everybody.
Hello.
Hey, I've really been enjoying the program tonight.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, thank you. However, no, it does not require as the requirements are laid out to read any of that.
I do want to
That's
ask
too
you.
bad.
And I'm not okay with that. Don't get me wrong. I will add that when I have taught that merit badge many, many times, I do insist that we do it, but it's not a requirement.
But it's so the Constitution is quite short.
Right.
And so it's not like you're telling them that they need to read the Federal Register or something like that,
It's only about 4,000 or 4,400 words.
That's right.
Mhm.
Oh, I am not in disagreement with that. I think everyone should read that along with the Declaration of Independence in its entirety.
And yes,
I agree. Yes.
yes, I agree too. And it's and of course, we're hoping that people around the world will be tuning in or coming back and looking at this one and listening to it. And that's one of the things one of the problems I have with many countries, all other countries essentially, don't have a written constitution. And so it's basically what Parliament decides or what the dictator decides, or
Right.
you remember that great in The Patriot, that movie where the man said, I'd rather have one tyrant 5,000 miles away than 5,000 tyrants 1 mile away. And
Right. And I love what C.S. Lewis wrote, how
we're having a link problem there. Go ahead, Doug.
it would be far better, C.S. Lewis wrote, to have a corrupt, sort of debauched leader than to have a government by a bunch of super conscientious busybodies. Because as Lewis wrote, the corrupt leader, eventually his debauchery will be satiated. He'll be satisfied. But the leaders who oppress us for our own good, to try to be moral busybodies, boy, they will be fanatical and their oppression will never be satisfied. And I think that that's what we're facing now throughout the Western world, especially in the English-speaking countries of the world. We now have a sort of a super graduate school educated ruling class of elites who have rejected God. They have rejected Judeo-Christianity. They've rejected the Bible. They've rejected our past. They regard America's founding fathers as little more than racist slaveholders and sexist and homophobic. And the same thing has happened in Canada and in Britain and Australia. And so there has been a war on history. There has been an effort to erase history. And I think that George Orwell wrote the greatest political book ever in 1948. And he came up with the title 1984 by reversing the end of the year there. And in 1984, he writes about a society where you have a dictatorship of zealots who want to have total control over every aspect of every citizen's life. And Winston Smith, the protagonist, his job is to, whenever the government wants to rewrite history to appease or to fit the present public policies, he erases past history. He flushes it down the memory hole. And Orwell wrote that who controls the present controls the past. Who controls the past controls the future. If you can dictate how the next generation, what the next generation is going to learn about history, if you can dictate to the next generation of young people who their heroes of the past are and who their villains are, who were the good guys of the past, who were the bad guys, wow, that you're going to have a profound impact on how that generation is going to vote for the rest of its lives and how they're going to teach their children regarding who the good guys and bad guys of history are.
And take what you just said is identical to the victor writes the history.
Yes. Winston Churchill wrote that 6-volume history of the Second World War because he wanted to get his first draft of history in regarding the Second World War. And when he was at, his Sir Winston's reward for winning World War II, for saving Britain from the Nazis, was to be promptly voted out of office.
Exactly.
And he was asked, how is history going to treat you, Sir Winston? Well, and he said, history is going to treat me well, for I intend to write it. And he did. What we're seeing now is we have so many radical, woke leftists who are waging war.
Well, let's do this. But let's remember that I think we don't want to get too political.
Okay, but I think the truth is that there are many people in this country today, and they're coming from the left, radical left, who are wanting to tear down not just Confederate statues, they're wanting to tear down, they've already either torn down, desecrated, graffitied, vandalized, or had removed through local political officials, pressure on them, statues of Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Teddy Roosevelt, Christopher Columbus. And I think that these radical leftists, they want to so desecrate, to demonize American history and really the history of Judeo-Christianity, that young people will think, well, gee, we don't have any history worthy of preserving. So let's start afresh. Let's start new. Let's radically change all of our society.
Well, let me ask this, Dr. Young, if you don't mind, as someone who's spoken on standing tall for historical heroes like that.
Thank you.
How can we teach scouts to preserve history without whitewashing it or erasing it entirely? What's something that we
teach
can do?
All of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. In all of my history classes, whenever I talked about any president, I would talk about his upbringing, all the influences on him from his family, schooling, his time and his place. And we would talk about what he did, and we would talk about the praises for him, but we would also criticize him. We would make the case against him as well. But I would try to help everybody understand that we are all products of our time and place. Mm-hmm. The fact that I was born in 1961 in Bartow, Florida, into a middle-class Protestant Southern family, the son of educators. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s. I was in graduate school. I'm white, male, heterosexual, middle class, Protestant. I mean, all of that colors my views of history, my views of everything. It's not to say that your geography or your race or your sex or your class dictates anything. But I dare say, if I was born if I was born on the Four Corners Navajo Reservation in northern Arizona, my guess is I would have some rather different views. And something that I tried to get my students to understand is we really ought to try hard, in my opinion, to avoid the sin of presentism, judging people from the past by the standards of the present. If we're lucky, or if our grandchildren are lucky, we'll all be regarded as primitive barbarians in a couple of generations. And from my reading of history, with the exception of Jesus Christ, nobody was ever perfect. We're all flawed. And for me, the fact that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, Dick Russell, all these great men of history, they also were sinners, and they made mistakes, and they had faults and flaws. That makes their achievements all the more noble. The fact that they had a lot to struggle against, the fact that their success did not come easily, that they had to overcome a lot. And Teddy Roosevelt wrote, when he wrote about how the man of action is in the arena, and you don't want to be just a critic or someone who's too timid to get involved. Scouts, like everybody else, should be very engaged civically, should go to city council meetings, should vote religiously in every election, should write letters to their mayor, to their city councilman, their county commissioner, their congressman, etc., to be involved. When you don't vote, what you're saying is, my self-esteem is so pitifully low, I'm willing to allow perfect strangers who don't know or care about me from Adam, who may not share any of my values, any of my hopes and dreams, I'm willing to let them vote in my stead. We'd never let anybody choose where we're going to apply for work or choose what teacher to take for a class, but yet we're going to let some stranger choose who the president is going to vote in our behalf for president or congressman or for a U.S. senator. That's ridiculous. And sure, they're all sinners. Yes, but every vote I've ever made was a lesser or the least of the evils. Why do we expect perfection from politicians any more than we do from anybody else? We're all sinners. Who is it who we most get angry at? Who is it who we most hate in life at times? The very people we love the most, our mothers, our fathers, our wives, our girlfriends, our boyfriends, our sons, our daughters, our brothers, our sisters. So, as William Faulkner wrote, you don't love because, you love despite. Not because of the virtues, but despite the faults. So life is not perfect. We end in heaven, and we're a heck of a lot closer to hell. Yeah. And so it's important for us to learn from the mistakes of the past, to recognize that we all are made of clay. We all make mistakes, but I'd a heck of a lot rather, to me, someone like Teddy Roosevelt, for all of his sins, for all of his mistakes, he did light years more good to help the world than some monk who may have been a perfect saint, but he simply stayed in a monastery and prayed all, umpteen hours a day. Yeah, he never sinned, but what good did he do? I mean, the great nations of the world that have contributed the most to mankind were countries like America. And we also sinned a lot too. But look at, if you want to find a country, if you got to study a country that never committed any big sins, never invaded anybody, never committed any terrible war crimes, well, study Switzerland. They're always, they're a bunch of cowards. They never go to war with anybody. They're always neutral. As with all the thousands of years of Swiss, peace and prosperity, what's the greatest achievement of the Swiss?
I'll tell you,
their elite guards that do
guard the Vatican.
They guard the Vatican. And I'll tell you another thing is that they were ready to fight Hitler, and they had the weapons. They were ready.
Where were they during the Holocaust? Where were they when the rest of Europe was being overrun? They were AWOL.
Well, I'll tell you what. Let's do. No. Well, let me put it this way.
And they were bankers for the Germans too, for the Nazis.
Let's.
They got a lot to answer for.
All right. Well, let's remember that we have a lot of friends around the world who are scouts, and some of them are Swiss.
Wonderful.
We should get him on the show and answer for this.
Yeah, that's right. We'll have to. Well, they say,
I
wait
love
a
it.
minute.
Hey,
You know, in
I'm going
Switzerland,
after the Nazis. I'm not going after the Germans.
well,
The Germans
on
were
the other
wonderful
hand, Doug,
people.
you know, Switzerland's a country where all the men are armed, and they're
I
all
think that's great. They've done a lot of good. But
all
I
right.
think the Swiss have a very shameful past in World War II. They were bankers for the Nazis, just as they've been bankers for the mafia. The Swiss, they got great chocolate, great cuckoo
Knives are super
clocks.
cool.
Great pocket knives and watches.
Right.
So
Well, wait.
I'm having a great time. This is wonderful.
Well,
However,
however,
I will say that the Swiss Guard that monitors and covers the Pope and the Vatican are supremely trained and adequate for that, based on centuries of history. And that's all I know with regard to that. But the Swiss, they traditionally, like you said, Dr. Young,
We'll do
They
that.
do a
less than
really
desirable
good
in the
job
history of
guarding that tiny little fiefdom called the Vatican. I give them that.
yeah.
I want to something pertinent here. We talked about the Constitution. We've talked about the Declaration of Independence. We've talked about common sense. We've talked about all the things I wanted to hear on this Citizenship in the Nation podcast, and now Citizenship in the World podcast, I would say. What is at least one, but up to three fundamental principles of the U.S. Constitution that every citizen in the nation should understand to be truly prepared as a young person, as a scout?
I think that the Bible puts it very well that unto those whom much has been given, much is required. The book of Luke talks about that. And Sir Winston Churchill said the price of greatness is responsibility. And our Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, guarantees the American people far more God-given rights than any other country in the history of the world has ever enjoyed. But with every one of those constitutionally guaranteed rights given us by God comes a moral responsibility to exercise that right morally, responsibly, and
Ethically.
And so I think that I would hope that scouts and everybody, blessed like Americans are to live in a very free society, that we do not abuse our freedom, that we do not pervert our liberty into license. Yes, we have the freedom to get drunk every day if we're adults, and provided we don't get behind the wheel of a car or bother anybody else, we can drink ourselves into an early grave. We have that freedom. But just as Justice Potter Stewart wrote, just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean that it's the morally right thing to do. So I would say that's very important. I think also our founding fathers, even though they didn't like to use the word democracy, Benjamin Franklin said democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting for what's for lunch. Liberty is a well-armed sheep contesting the vote. But still, our fathers gave us way more democracy than any other people in history. But a Democratic majority can do anything it wants. Hitler would have absolutely won any fair Democratic vote throughout Nazi Germany. And the Democratic majority often chooses wrongly. Who did the crowd vote to save? Christ or the murderer Barabbas? The murderer Barabbas. So yes, we have way more power in this country to elect people to run our government, but that's no guarantee that we will do a good job. We must always exercise our vote responsibly. We need to carefully scrutinize every single candidate for public office, find out as much about him as possible.
And I'll also add additionally that if everybody chose to live their life by the principle and the what's the word I'm looking for? For scouting, help me out, Elliot.
The golden rule?
No, not well. Yeah,
Scout law.
that, truly. But what's the scouting?
Do a good turn daily. Be prepared. Trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent.
I know all that, but
I'm getting there, right?
I'm sorry. The mission statement of scouting.
Can't pull that one off the top of my head.
Well, yeah.
But also, you asked me for 3 U.S. constitutional contributions to our society that Scouts should recognize or should learn about. And I would say everybody should learn about. A third one I would say would be justice, that we have a judicial system in this country that is our courts are the most powerful in the world. Only America's courts have the authority to even overrule laws passed by the national legislature and to overrule actions of the national chief executive, the leader. And so we have very powerful courts. And it's very incumbent upon us as voters that we elect at the federal level good presidents to nominate good federal judges and U.S. Supreme Court justices, and that we elect good U.S. senators to confirm good people to the federal bench and to reject people who would not be good. But we have a really complicated judicial system, and Lord knows Walker, as a lifelong attorney, knows way more about it than I do. But we have a judicial system that says that someone is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. People have all kinds of constitutionally guaranteed rights. That we don't have mob justice or vigilante justice, and we accord even some very sleazy people all kinds of judicial constitutional protections, so that hopefully no innocent person will be wrongfully prosecuted or convicted and lose his freedom. And so our system of government is very much rooted in the principles of Aristotle. We have a mixed constitutional system where we have elements of democracy, but we also have elements of royalty, elitism, like a president, although we now, of course, and for a long, long time have elected him. And we also have sort of an elite aristocracy in the form of the courts. But Aristotle believed that only with a mixed constitutional system, where you have some democracy, but you also have some elitism and you have some authoritarianism on the part of one person as well. We're juggling all these different factors. And I think that has helped us. I mean, the fact that we copped our founding fathers, they were great comparative political scholars. They were the greatest, most scholarly, well-read political revolutionaries in history. They had studied all the major philosophers, and they copied from Charles-Louis Montesquieu of France the principle that we need to have a written constitution. We need to have a 3-branched government, separation of powers with the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and we need to have a separation. We need to have checks and balances so that each branch of government checks and balances the other 2 branches, so that no one branch ever gets too big for its britches, so to speak. So I think that for Scouts and for all Americans, and for anybody around the world who wants to learn from the Constitution, I would hope that they would learn about the principles of freedom, that freedoms, all of our rights come not from government, not from man, but from God. And governments, as Jefferson wrote, are set up to respect and enforce, to recognize, respect, and enforce, to guarantee those rights granted us by God. And we trust the people a lot more than we trust elites to govern us, to know what's best for us. And so I think generally, as often, Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. For all of its faults, for all of its problems, I think that peoples throughout history who have lived in democratic societies have tended to have a lot more freedom and a lot more equality of rights, a lot more opportunity, a lot more prosperity than people living in dictatorial societies. Now, there are many exceptions to that, but on the whole, I think that's right. But also, I think that it's really important that we really respect minority rights. You're not really free unless you have the right to say what is the least popular thing you can say. It's no test of freedom for me to stand here and say, oh, I love America. The real test of freedom is for me to say, I hate America, or I hate the Constitution. That's the real test of freedom. Not that I should get a gold star for that, but can I say it without being thrown in jail, without losing my job, that kind of thing. But people should have the freedom to hire who they want. And if someone doesn't, if I have a business and I don't like somebody trashing the Constitution, hey, I should have a right to fire it. That's freedom too. You should have the freedom to and the private property rights to do pretty much on your private property what you want, I believe. I believe you have the freedom to swing your fist. It just stops at the other fellow's nose. But I think and I would really defer to Walker on this, of course, but I think that a lot of people fail to understand our judicial system and our court system about how, particularly our criminal justice system, that it's really important that while we do prosecute criminals, that they always get a fair trial, that people are always legally presumed innocent until found guilty in a court of law, and the burden of proof regarding their guilt should be on the government. The government should have to prove to a jury of 12 people that they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
On that note, I think maybe we should call this an evening. I'm looking at my watch. We could go on for hours about what's right and what's wrong. And those are great thoughts. I keep thinking all the time about, for example, the scout is brave. He has the courage to stand up for the right against the coaxings of friends and the jeers or threats of enemies. But and I sometimes sit there and think scouts, whether they're American or Swiss or Kenyan or whatever, they also have a duty. And you talked about that duty where you've been given, for example, the duty of helping the stranger who's out there and your life-saving or your first aid or those skills you learn, that you don't just sit back and watch somebody bleed to death or drown or whatever. You go forth because you're a scout. Right. And that's kind of what Baden Powell and all those who've been active in scouting try to emphasize is that duty.
Especially Walker and Elliot are on Aids to Scouting.
That's right.
And there have been so many great Americans who were Boy Scouts and Eagle Scouts. The first who comes to mind is President Gerald Ford. He was an Eagle Scout.
Yep.
And he was the House Minority Leader in Congress, Vice President, and then President. And he was an outstanding Christian gentleman, in my opinion. And there are just so many other examples of great Americans who went through Cub Scouts, and Webelos, and Boy Scouts, and Eagle Scouts. And I think that the Scouts have so much to be proud of. And I applaud all the Scouts everywhere in America, Kenya, Switzerland, Germany, England, France, all of God's countries. And we're all God's children. And, the closest I ever came to getting arrested was when I was in 2013, I was in Qining, China. And I was walking down the street and I saw an honest to God protest in communist China. And I thought, oh, wow, my buddies are never going to believe this. I got to get a picture. So Dumb Doug pulls out his camera and takes a picture of this protest. And what it was about 20 little old ladies seated with pictures of their houses, and they were protesting in front of the Qining Police Department. And it was a housing protest. And in China, you can own your own home, but the government owns all the land in China. And the government can therefore do with your property, including your home, whatever it wants. So this housing protest was going on. These little old ladies, I guess they didn't want their houses to be bulldozed for the government to build something. And not even the Chinese communist dictatorship wants to be seen arresting little old ladies. That just doesn't look good. And so the ladies were there protesting, and there were 3 Chinese cops who were standing guard to make sure the little old ladies didn't get out of hand. Well, so I immediately pulled out my camera and I snapped a picture of them. Well, immediately these 3 cops were right on me right away, and the head cop was shouting at me and pointing at my camera. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to get arrested. I'm going to be thrown in this communist jail. What in the world am I going to do? And I don't speak much Chinese. I speak a little Chinglish words. And I know that the Chinese word for good is hao, and the Chinese word for bad is bu hao. And so I thought, I got to look like an even dumber American tourist than I am. And maybe I can appeal to this guy's sympathy. So I widened my eyes as wide as I could, and I pointed to my camera, and I went, boo-how! And the cop burst out laughing. He'd been over laughing so hard, he not only didn't arrest me, he didn't even take my camera, he didn't even take my film chip. The deal was that I would quickly go in the opposite direction, wave goodbye, and never turn back, and they'd let me go free. And so that's what I did. And the moral of the story is that, Chinese communist cop, he's from a different country, very different history, very different culture, very different religion, political orientation, different race, you name it. But he's still a child of God. He's equally a child of God. He is my brother, and he has a sense of humor too. We're all equally God's children, and we should all take everybody as an individual and judge everybody as an individual based on what he's done, not on what his daddy or his granddaddy or his great grandmama or anybody else did. And my Bible teaches me that God judges each of us on our individual merits, what each of us individually does. And I think that the Boy Scouts do a wonderful job of inculcating Judeo-Christian morals and the importance of citizenship and helping everybody. We are all our brother's keeper. We should be.
He's a friend to all and a brother to every other scout. All right.
Yes.
And with that, why don't we call it an evening? And everybody, we're glad you tuned in, and we hope you enjoyed this, and that you'll remember a lot of those names that Doug went through. And if you're not familiar with them, get familiar with them.
Get familiar.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all so very much. I'm honored and delighted to be here. Thank you, and God bless you all.
Thank you, Dr. Young. It's no surprise that you've gotten Professor of the Year award, probably more than once, but I see that you've gotten it at least once. Your passion for teaching is evident in just an hour and a few minutes that we've been talking. Thank you again for being on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of Aids to Scouting. Thanks for coming.